Baruch Hashem, we are gathering together today for awakening Torat Mussar Mindfulness. I am Rabbi Chasya Uriel Steinbauer, the founder and director of the Institute for Holiness, Kehilat Mussar Mindfulness, where we gather as a community to be on this path towards holiness, where we integrate the traditions, the teachings, the way of life of Mussar in the Jewish tradition, and the way of life and the path of mindfulness as laid out in Theravada Buddhism in the Dharma, where we integrate these ancestral wisdoms handed down to us so that we may learn from Hashem, from God, and our ancestors how to best live in a skillful, wise, kind, compassionate way. So today, we are a bit behind due to the winter illness, the season of winter illness. So I'm delighted to have you here. Today's date is Monday, January 27th. It is now 3:30 p.m. here in Haaretz, in the Galil in Israel. Welcome wherever you're joining us. So if you're joining us, obviously, from way over on the west side of the world, then it's earlier in the day on Monday. And if you're joining us anywhere where we are, through Europe, through Africa, then you're around the afternoon. And if you're joining us all the way over in the eastern seaboard of Japan, New Zealand, Australia, and the like, then you are heading into Tuesday. So what are we covering today? What do we do here during awakening? Welcome if you are new. If you are a seasoned practitioner, been sitting with me week in and week out, then you know what's going to happen. You're welcome to go to our YouTube channel to see past episodes. This will be our 12th sitting of the year of the Hebrew cycle of how we read the Torah portion, which began after Simchat Torah. And so we're ending the last reading of VAYECHI in the book of Genesis, in Bereshit. So we will give a summary, then we're going to pull out of the Torah portion what middah, what soul trait we could really begin to cultivate and focus here. Of course, our focus this year is on specific Mussar practices, but also Mussar mindfulness. We're looking at the 48 to 51 ways of acquiring Torah as laid out in the Mishnah, one of our ancient rabbinic texts of Jewish law. And we'll look at what we're to learn there and how that might be integrated into our practice. So first, I will give a summary. Before we begin, I might have to call up the sponsorship at the end of the session. We've been blessed to receive wonderful donations, sponsorships to strengthen this weekly public offering of awakening in honor of and in memory of my Ima, my mother, may her memory be for a blessing, who passed away on Rosh Chodesh Kislev. It's now been about 2 months. Yes, because we're coming up on Rosh Chodesh Shvat. I can't believe it. Where's the time coming? So, or going, as the saying is. So, I'm going to slowly pull up who our sponsorship is this week. And if I can't get it to it in a reasonable time, we'll just jump in with our live stream. Welcome on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or our YouTube channel, Mussar Mindfulness. Also at our website at kehilatmussar.com. Looking in the blog section, you can find both podcast audio file or video. So hopefully you're joining us live. If not, then you'll see the recording. So delighted to have you here. So let me just pull up what I can here. I think we'll jump into we'll jump in. Okay. And then I'll find where we can list and honor our latest sponsorship. Okay. So in VAYECHI, and Yaakov lived on. Yaakov is our third patriarch, right? Known as Jacob. His name was also changed to Israel, Yisrael. As I said, this is the final Torah portion and the first of the 5 books of Moshe, known as the Hebrew Bible. So this took place on January 11th, 2025, which was Yud Aleph, the 11th of Tevet, in the Hebrew year Tafshin Pei 5785. And a quick summary of that is, after 17 years in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, Yaakov's life has come to an end and he's joining the ancestors. Now, right when you hear the number 17, you should be thinking, where have I heard that before? So it's a big number, obviously in teenagehood, moving into adulthood in the Torah. First, we have Yitzhak, who is no, not Yitzhak. Yaakov is sent away at age 17 to go find a wife, essentially. But he's really sent away because of the lying and the kind of stealing of Esav's birthright and the blessing from the father, right? So he was 17 when he had to flee. Then Yosef, his favorite son, is also 17 when he is sent by his father to go check on, obviously, right? What does that mean? Check on meaning kind of spy and report what the brothers were doing when they were shepherding in Shechem and also outer. And so he's 17 when his brothers see him, attempt to, in some ways, murder him, throw him into a pit, and leave him to starve or worse, and then decide to sell him in slavery unless he gets sold by other traders. But he's 17. He's 17 when he ends up being sold into slavery down in Egypt. Okay, so 17 is a big number. And so when Yaakov is reunited with Yosef down in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, he spends another 17 years there. So there seems to be something significant about that. And Yaakov, on his deathbed, essentially, blesses Yosef's 2 sons, which are Menashe and Ephraim. And Yosef places Menashe at Yaakov's right side and Ephraim's left side. So in ancient Near Eastern culture, the right side is where you bless, the left side is less so. Sometimes you don't even use or touch things with the left hand, more so in other cultures than in Judaism. But Yaakov crosses his hands like this. He decides to bless Ephraim with the greater blessing, right? And he says because Ephraim, meaning not Ephraim the person, but Ephraim the tribe that will kind of emerge out of him over time, will be greater than Menashe. Yaakov then gives his final brachot, if you want to call them blessings, to each of his children. Some of them, it's pretty clear they're not really brachot. They're more finally maybe what Yaakov should have said a long time ago. We'll get into that. Yaakov then instructs his children to bury him in the Ma'ara, in the cave that his ancestor Avraham bought in the field of Machpelah, back in the land of Canaan. And that's where actually Leah, one of Yaakov's wives, is buried, and also his parents and his grandparents. They're all buried in that cave. Yaakov then goes to the ancestors. He dies, and his family in Egypt mourned for him, and then they bury him as they ask. So he gets embalmed in order to keep his body, and he's taken up to be put in the cave. Yosef's brothers are afraid on their travels back from the land of Canaan, returning to Egypt. You should already be wondering, like, why aren't they staying in the land of Canaan? Why are they returning to Egypt? The Torah does not tell us. There's lots of speculation. But for one great commentator, I think it might be Arbarbanel from Spain, he says this is already a sign that their status and who they are is deteriorating, that they're controlled by the state, that you can't just leave as a whole group of people, and this is what it is now, 12 huge, large families and tribes, you can't just leave without the permission of the state, and even then the state probably most likely, meaning Egypt, will not let you leave. You can maybe go up to bury someone, and then you're to return. As you can see in the Torah portion, the officials of Egypt travel with the brothers and the family. So there's clearly an element of control going on here. So they return, and on their journey back, the brothers suddenly face pachad, fear of the consequences of their almost murdering and selling their brother into slavery. They fear now that without the patriarch's protection, when really that's who they were angry at in the first place, Yaakov, without him being alive, they fear that Yosef will take revenge against them. Might be warranted, but I'll leave that. Yosef calms them down and said it was all part of God's plan for him to come to Mitzrayim so he could save them from famine. Notice how it's worded. He doesn't say it's all part of God's plan that you threw me into a bore and didn't listen to into a pit and didn't listen to my cries for mercy and ignored me and sat down and ate a meal and then sold me into slavery. God did not intend, right? Like, was it really God's plan? That he's not saying it's not God's plan that all that happened. And then I had to serve in slavery during the prime years of my growing adulthood from age 17 to 33. Okay. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say it was God's plan that I be enslaved and go through all this, right? No, he says it's God's plan to come to Mitzrayim. The God meant for him to get down there. How he ends up down there, pretty brutal and harsh. Some would say it's God's plan, that it's what he had to go through. But you notice he doesn't say that, right? Okay. Then Yosef lives to see his great-grandchildren, and he makes his family swear to take his bones with them when they leave Egypt. So he knows that they're one day going to leave, that God is going to pull them out. They'll eventually leave, and when he dies, he wants his bones to go up and to be with the ancestors in the cave. Okay, so then he dies. This is the end of the Parasha. The brothers also end up passing away, but there's some key things here, right? That we're going to focus on. There's such master themes going on throughout the whole Bereshith, right? We start with a family unit where the brother murders the brother, right? Cain and Hevel. And then we learn of a righteous man who walks with God, Noach, but I don't even want to say but. And he follows God's directive exactly and he doesn't seek to save anyone else. Okay, and that becomes an issue for a lot of the rabbis. I think it's enough that he followed God's directive exactly. How many of us would follow exactly that we are to build this huge teva boat, collect all the animals, save the next generation? Okay, that's that. We don't see, and then unfortunately, there's a lot of unhealthy family dynamics, right? The one of the sons, Ham, humiliates his father. We don't know exactly how. And then you, of course, move into Avraham, first known as Avram, who will head towards more of the path of holiness and righteousness. However, also, compromising the health and well-being and safety of his wife, Sarai, to Sarah, and then eventually first to his son Yishmael by sending him out, abandoning him, telling him to leave with his Ima, his mother Hagar, and then almost murdering, sacrificing his son Yitzhak based on the directive of God. His wife then dying, we presume, from the news. Torah doesn't tell us. So some really difficult family dynamics, so much so that when Avraham comes down the mountain after trying to sacrifice his son, he goes down alone, and Yitzhak goes down alone his way. We don't hear them ever communicate and work through what just happened. Okay, so there's not a lot of forgiveness. There's not a lot of teshuvah, of repentance, of even recognizing that maybe someone did something wrong or hurtful or harmful. And then, of course, you have Yitzhak, who favors a son, just like sons have been favored all the way through this. Yitzhak gets favored ahead of Yishmael. And now we have Esav is going to be favored because of his hunting and meat, but he won't actually receive the blessing. It will be Yaakov who is favored by the mother, and they're Esav, based on how Yaakov treats him, ends up the potential for violence and harm again. He wants to murder him. He has to flee. And then Yaakov ends up in terrible family dynamic of basically how he treated his father, who was blind and dying, by lying to him. Gets done to him by Lavan, his uncle, who lies to him about who he's going to marry, then kind of locks him into indentured servitude for many years in order to pay for the bridal price of these two women he ends up marrying, Leah and Rachel. He ends up favoring one wife, Rachel. That's already a nightmare when you start to favor one spouse or one child. He ends up having 12 sons and favors a son. First, Yosef, and then when he thinks he's dead, he favors Yosef's younger brother, Binyamin. Okay, all these are recipes for disaster in families. We do it all the time. If you're not admitting that to yourself, then it might be time to look in the mirror of how much a child will be favored, a parent will be favored, and how we might mitigate that, how we might practice in a skillful, wise way not to act it out as much as we can. We can't maybe change the feeling inside, but we can contain it. We can practice around it. We can maybe even work on cultivating more love and attention for the child or spouse that we are distancing from or don't have the same pull and attraction to. So anyway, there's just not what we have finally when Yaakov becomes Israel and reunites with his brother that he lied to and stole from, Esav. We have not forgiveness and necessarily teshuvah, but you have reconciliation, which is a beginning, okay? More than a lot of families do. So they reconcile. He finally pays back the blessing he stole, 550 animals. Everything seems to be copacetic, right? So Esav heads off his way, Yaakov heads off his way. That's the first model. Then, of course, we have what we're leading into, the Yosef story, and then finally the tribal story. Favoring Yosef, it was a recipe for disaster. The 10 sons who were living at the time resented and began to hate the child, Yosef, because they can't hate the father. In that culture, that it's just not going to happen. Okay. So it gets taken out on the vulnerable and the 17-year-old son, where these are older brothers in their 20s and 30s who behave in completely unskillful, unwise, hateful ways. Okay. So they don't listen to him anymore. They hurt him and sell him off into slavery. When they finally reunite in Egypt years later, you know the whole Yosef story. We've covered it in the previous Parshiot. We finally get to a model where first we actually get to witness Yosef, someone who's been harmed by the family, but now has power. Okay, that might be the difference. He has power, he's secure, he's safe there, even though he doesn't feel safe with all 10 of them showing up. That's clear. He works through his own teshuvah. He works through his own, how can I learn to be with these people, feed them, make sure they don't die in the famine, especially my father, who I care about, and my younger brother, Binyamin. How can I work through this trauma and perhaps forgive or perhaps accept? Sometimes they need to happen separately and at different times. So he works through that. And then we see Yehuda. Yehuda, who was the one that actually suggested, let's sell him into slavery so that we could actually benefit from this instead of just him dying, being killed, murdered. So he, by losing his own 2 sons by God's hand, because they did an act that was asur, forbidden by God, to their potential wife, Tamar. I mean, she was a wife, but how they behaved. So he knows loss. He's already lost 2 sons. He doesn't even allow the 3rd son to marry her. He ends up sleeping with her, causing her to get pregnant with twins. He has to go through his own path and painful growth. So what we see when he returns and he's in Egypt with the brothers is we see someone new. We see someone who is for the first time able to face the pain of his father, and that the pain will become even more if Binyamin doesn't return. And so he has done his own internal teshuvah and is willing to put his own life on the line in order to stop the pain to the father. That's new. That's new in all the family drama. We didn't see that development inside with Adam and Chava all the way through. This kind of internal awareness of the other, of wanting to cause rachamim, compassion, of not wanting to cause more harm and suffering. Okay, so we see this change, we see this growth and development. It all comes together in VAYECHI. Okay, why does it come together in VAYECHI? The brothers I will say this first. When Yaakov dies, this time the blessing that's being done to the sons is done with consent, is done with power, with some agency on the behalf of the father. It's done without lying. And it's done without taking advantage of the elder patriarch who's about to die. So that's already a huge shift. Now, you might say, okay, you have to always look at Mussar of the change in extreme of behavior, where there might be imbalance, right? So we see that change with the sons. But you also notice in the speech of Yaakov, the speech might not be so balanced. There might be some really aggressive, if not passive aggressive, ways of finally telling it like it is. To, of course, Reuven, who I call it rape. It's called, he sleeps with one of his father's wife, Bilha, in order to take over power from the father. I explained that this was common, or at least known behavior in the ancient Near East, that the eldest son might do this when the the patriarch's getting an older age, in order to take over power, or when the father dies, he might take the wives of the father. Okay, so Reuven did that. And then Shimon and Levi obviously committed genocide in Shechem, killing all males, including young boys, in response or reactivity to their sister being raped by one man, Hamor, the donkey. So that violence, that uncontrolled rage, the father, Yaakov, does not want to have anything to do with. It doesn't want future tribes of Israel to do anything with it. I do love the reading that we'll get into, where one of the commentators teaches us that that what he might be actually giving here is cursing. If you look at the language, he's cursing their anger, not them personally. And through that language, to curse their anger, we learn from Kizkuni, who comes from France 800 years ago, that he reads that as a bracha, as a blessing. The blessing is that may Shimon and Levi learn not to act through their anger. And how will they learn not to do that? This is very Mussar. Are you ready for this? They'll learn it by finding that their anger does not make them successful. So they have to, in some sense, set up the conditions and making sure everyone around them does not reward them for their anger in the future. If you want to stop people from acting out with anger and rage, you can't reward them for their behavior. Otherwise, it'll just continue. Here's a perfect live example of this, right? Hamas, right? And other terrorist groups. They kidnap Israelis. They know they can do this. They know that they will be imprisoned. And they know that later on that they can negotiate to have their prisoners released, people sentenced to life sentences because they've murdered Israelis or committed acts of terror, crimes against humanity. And they'll know that Israel will go ahead and negotiate to get the Israeli hostages back that they kidnapped, and by releasing the terrorists who are in prison. Okay, this is a cycle that will never end, because the terrorists know that they're rewarded for kidnapping Israelis. And when you have to create the conditions that they're not rewarded for that behavior. It was William Chamberlain, in his wonderful commentary on this, who actually advised Israel that it's time for Israel to actually execute terrorists, execute people who kidnap Israelis. And this will teach them that they are no longer going to be imprisoned and then released later for kidnapping Israelis. You break the cycle. There's no more reward in kidnapping Israelis. That hasn't happened yet, obviously. Instead, we have this old cycle of pattern where even Israel is caught up in it. That's a long story that we can talk about, of why we as Jews and the state of Israel continues to behave this way. Okay, it's deeply rooted in great intentions to respect life, to not want to commit the death penalty. It's one of our central values that's been handed down over thousands of years. And it may be time to review it. It may be time to listen to William Chamberlain and others who say, you can't continue this cycle. Okay, so Shimon and Levi, Kuni says, It's time to set up the conditions that they are not going to be rewarded for their crazy rage where they go and murder people and be rewarded through their anger, essentially, because there were no consequences for Shimon and Levi's behavior. They went on living their lives. Okay, they will continue to act out in anger like that, and maybe even murder, because there are no consequences. Okay, so I will also say there's no fighting over the blessings that are given or the curses that are given between Ephraim and Manasseh, and also between the 12 brothers. There's no fighting. There's no, I wish I had that blessing, or I'm going to steal that blessing. None of that goes on. So we've seen a lot of tikkun, lot of repair, lot of changed behavior. Incredible. Okay. Very incredible. So now getting into the fear of revenge, right? That once the patriarch dies, Yosef, who settles their fear, right? What we see here is that the brothers don't want peace. They don't want shalom. They want to escape consequence of their behavior. It ends up becoming a Jewish value that things this large, that the consequences weren't delivered right when the act of the crime happens or afterwards, that the consequence shall be handled by God. I firmly disagree with this. Not that I think Yosef should take matters into his own hands with his power and, commit capital punishment and murder his brothers, or hold them responsible by putting them in prison for the rest of their lives, which would happen for someone who kidnaps someone and sells them into slavery. However, what we're witnessing is that there's no rule of law. There's no consequences for capital crimes of this state, of this large. That are crimes against humanity. So it is left up in some ways to either individuals doing the revenge, which shouldn't even be called revenge; it should be called consequence, or to saying we'll leave it up to God. God will handle the consequence or punishment. Okay, this is why it's very obvious in the Torah that there needs to be a shift, and we see it slowly happening away from individual and tribal violence and consequence to communal rule of law, to a nation. And we'll see that shift in the book of Shemot coming up, right? In the book of Exodus in English. Okay, so let's move on. So Mussar as a path sees the ability to practice and grow can only happen in matters that are between a human being and his or her neighbor or his or her family members. We're not going to go, we don't believe this idea that someone goes off and isolates will grow that way. Someone who lives alone will not grow, or at least not grow in the same way. It has to be in relationship. And the growth and the practice is rooted in everyday life. For instance, the altar of Novarodok, one of the 3 schools of Mussar, said is the only true index to proper functioning of character, how we're balancing our middah and how we're developing as a human being, is community service. Deeply rooted in relationship with the other and trying to serve the other, making the world a better place, right? And that's the only way we can actually grow and change, is through those deeds, okay? Making more skillful choices. The idea that practice effectively reduces, the path of Mussar mindfulness, the practices, they reduce enslavement to habit-bound reactivity. Like we don't see Yosef dealing with his trauma other than how he names his children, right? Ephraim and Manasseh, or Manasseh and Ephraim. And we don't see him deal with it until the 10 brothers are in his face. Then he has to deal with the demons, with the shadow side, with what he hasn't faced, which sometimes is a lot of pain and suffering. Okay. And one of the key practices, and I had really trouble here narrowing this down to like one middah, one soul trait that this whole Torah Parasha can have us pay attention to. There's a lot of things happening at once. So the first is ometz lev, which really means like a strengthening of the heart. We translate it as moral courage. It's the ability to be upright and to be able to make the right decisions, be wise and skillful in our choices of speech, thought, and deed, even when we're afraid, right? Courage doesn't mean that we're free from fear. It's just that we behave from that tool. But in order to it's not enough to be courageous, right? The courage always has to be demonstrated through a deed. And so what we see happening here is great savlanut. Now, not savlanut the way it is in modern Hebrew. That would be sovlanut, right? This tolerance, tolerating. But in Mussar, the path of Mussar, savlanut is about bearing the burden with others. We translate it as patience, but in English, patience does not capture what savlanut means in Hebrew, which is this real bearing the burden. It doesn't mean it's a pleasant practice or experience. You're balanced in it when it might still be really kind of unpleasant to be practicing it. It's unique in that way. We see everyone bearing the burden of their situation in this Torah portion. We see Yaakov bearing the burden, giving a little bit curses, blessing. The man is finally speaking after all these years of how he used such unwise speech towards Esav and his father, even towards Lavan, even how he spoke. Just there's so much about him that there was fear there. There wasn't ometz lev to say what needed to be said and not acting out. Like when he finally was reunited with Lavan, before he reunited with Esav, he just it was like a vomiting, right? All the years of anger and pain. This is not a role model for us. So we see him finally bearing the burden of trying to figure out how on my deathbed can I share that I'm not okay with what Reuven did. I'm not okay with what Shimon and Levi did, because what did he do when they actually committed the act? He held his tongue. He was completely silent. It was an unbalanced form of shtika, of silence. It shouldn't have happened. Okay? He even does it with Reuven. He's silent. He hears about it and he's silent. Okay? No. So he's bearing the burden. All 12 brothers are bearing the burden of receiving these curses and blessings. They're all trying to live together and work it out. Yosef is bearing the burden of, still living with these 10 brothers, not including Benjamin, who caused such harm and suffering. So a lot of savlanut, and it also ties to right speech, as we call it in the path of the Dharma. Really wise, skillful speech, saying what needs to be said when it needs to be said, if the person's ready to hear it, if it's honest, if it's kind, if it's timely, all the things, right? So it's like what happened with Yaakov is this idea of when to speak it, when to show it, when to mitigate it, when to soften it, or when to keep silent. That was Yaakov's curriculum. He was practicing, he was getting better. Was it 100% on his deathbed? No. But may that be a lesson to all of us who struggle with right speech, which I think most of us do, if not all. that we can see like Yaakov, that we're on this path towards, mitigated, wise, softening speech, being silent when we should, speaking when we should. So that's there. That's there for us to see. In some ways, there's great consequences of unskillful, unwise speech. We see him having kind of no concern in some way or responsibility towards his speech and the truth and the consequences, because he's going to die, and he dies. We don't see how this was received by the brothers. We don't see what it might have cost later on. Okay, we can feel it. We can feel that, but we can't know for sure. Let me just look at one commentary here I wanted to share with you if I still have it. And then we're going to move into some quick other teachings. Okay, so what is obviously missing? We don't know if Yaakov knows what the brothers did to Yosef. He doesn't mention it on the deathbed. We think he would if he did know. But what's clear is happening is maybe it even begins through, on this deathbed of blessing and curses, is aggravating the old and buried fears of retribution, which then will get acted out when they're returning from the land of Canaan, right? So much so that after his death and burial, right, the brothers send through a shaliach, a messenger, to Yosef. They can't even come and speak, right? Claiming that their father, that Yaakov commanded, please, I beg of you, forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, though they inflicted harm upon you. This is in Genesis chapter 50, verse 17. Whether or not Yosef really said that, a lot of people don't. A lot of our rabbinic commentators don't think that he did, because we think that he would say something on the deathbed. There's a lot of pain and sadness receiving this through a shaliach. It's not very wise or skillful. Our truth, our sharing of wise speech, of emet, we have to look at how we share it. We have to be full of savlanut, of bearing the burden of it. We have to be aware and consideration of potential, if not real, consequences, of seeing clearly. There's so much complicated going on. I don't want to say this is threefold, right? We have to have the ometz lev, we have to have the courage, the moral courage, and it has to come out in bearing the burden with the other, savlanut, and it has to come out in wise speech, of truth, of emet, done, right? So the 12th way in the Mishnah that we acquire Torah is known as yishuv. Okay, settledness. It really comes from yishuv da'at, which is a settledness of the mind, often translated as peace of mind. So we're cultivating yishuv da'at, which is very much tied to menuchat hanefesh, the middah of equanimity. This real centeredness, seated consciousness that's done through persistent, hardworking effort of really sitting in our daily mindfulness meditation, learning how to watch the maneuverings of the mind without reacting, and to know that everything is ephemeral and will pass, and that we're not our thoughts. To be able to develop that skill so that we don't react is yeshuv hadat, is overtime, right? And this cultivation is so important, okay? The opposite that gets discussed is this idea that when we don't have yeshuv da'at, we have let me find it here. tiruf hada'at, right? What the Ran called a mind state where there is conflict between what we see before us, what we know, some call the intellect, and between emotions, which is also reactivity, right? So when there is this kind of, tiruf comes from when there's a predator who obviously rips, it comes from the shorish, the root of ripping apart an animal. That's the mind, right? It's not settled. There is intense either denial, pushing away. Something's really unwanted and we react that way, or something's really desired and wanted, and there's a lot of unhealthy attachment. And that also unsettles, right? There's a real tearing of the mind. And so we can see when the brothers are traveling home from the land, back to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, that they have this tiruf hada'at, this real caught up in reactivity. And so have to send this agent to try to make sure Yosef is not going to act out in revenge, which I would see as just holding them to consequence for the behavior. But what happens with us, why we even want to see this as a way to cultivate Torah, is it's so key that the mind be in alignment with intention, desire, and states, and we can witness them and not react. It's a real training of the mind, right? And to be able to witness without conflict, tension, and stress. It doesn't mean the stuff around us is not going to be full of conflict, tension, and stress, but we can face it by seeing clearly and not get caught up in the reactivity. It's a clearing of the mind tied to minuchat nefesh, of equanimity. So one of the clear examples of how we use this in the path of Mussar Mindfulness is that we have to look at what disturbs us, our peace of mind, our settled mind, right? So, for instance, my teacher, one of my teachers, Dr. Alan Morenas, likes to teach that he noticed in his sitting meditation, for instance, that constantly his mind went to planning for the future. What do I have to do next? What's happening? I have to do that. He realized it was tied to the middah of bitachon and a lack of it, an imbalance, that he did not trust in God, that the things in the future were going to be just fine. They were going to turn out exactly as God intended. They might not be exactly what he wanted personally, but that there would be what was best for him in the end, and a real trust in that. And so he learned from the practice that he needed to cultivate more trust, right? And to be able to witness it when the mind came up to planning, oh, there's planning again. And not to get caught up at it and run away with it like a railroad, right? Like a train on a railroad. Like, okay, I see that planning's coming. I'm going to turn this over to God. So this is definitely part of the acquisition of Torah. It's essential for spiritual growth in the path. And one of the key ways that, for instance, Rav Kook teaches how do we develop yishuv da'at, right? This settling of the mind is by being out in nature, taking walking meditation out in the park, in the forest, wherever you may walk, sitting meditation out in the forest, really listening to and observing and seeing clearly all that manifests in front of us, and be able to watch without reactivity as a witness. That phenomenon over time in that natural environment really has this beautiful effect on developing Yishuv Da'at. So that is coming from our Mishnah. And then I will finally close with, before we move into our own meditation. Oh, okay. So what does Yosef seek to do with his brothers, who are clearly in Tiruf Da'at, in this torn, ripped up mind out of fear, right? Fear that they're going to have to face consequences for their behavior. He settles their mind. He settles them by settling the middah that they're not balanced in, which of course is bitachon, trust in God, and fear, right? Pachad. They had great fear. It was taking over. So much so that they couldn't even speak to him. They had to send a messenger. So he settles that. He settles that fear. He knows what to address first. Don't worry. I'm not going to act out in revenge. God sent me here to save you from the famine. Wow. Can you imagine your sibling saying that to you? So beautiful, beautiful. This is like incredible Torah portion, and the conclusion of Bereshit is we witness this beautiful moving from guilt and remorse to some form of forgiveness, some form of teshuvah, a really beautiful acting of ometz lev, of moral courage, of savlanut, of patience, bearing the burden, and of course, wise speech, the truth when it's can be heard and it's needed and ready. So one of the key ways that we develop this is through the practice of chesed, of loving kindness. Particularly when we feel the exact opposite. So one of the key practices is that when we feel the opposite of chesed, feel comparative mind, judgment mind, fear, is to recognize that we're having it and immediately go into a deed as best and quickly as we can, whether in speech, thought, or actual physical deed of kindness to somebody, maybe to ourselves, but more so to others. So I'm going to move you through a quick chesed, metta, loving kindness meditation where we're going to be sending out thoughts and prayers of kindness and also towards ourselves. So I invite you to assume your meditation posture, whether it's seated on a zafu or in the chair like myself, standing in a strong mountain pose, or walking back and forth in walking meditation, not going anywhere in particular, or lying down, keeping the eyes open so that you don't fall asleep. For the rest of us seated, come to the edge of the seat so you're upright, strong, but also centered and relaxed. That beautiful combination that happens, awake and alert, as we say, right? Calm, inviting that calmness, inviting yourself fully here. I invite you to close your eyes if you're seated like me, otherwise lower your gaze and invite the gift of oxygen from God. Inhalation and exhale. Feel free to make a sound on the exhale. Inhalation, raising the shoulders. And exhale, letting them drop and fall. What a gift to be alive and awake and gathering together to practice together. Allowing yourself to really feel that. And finally, letting your breath fall to its own natural rhythm. No need to control it. You might want to put your hand on your chest to feel your own love and compassion towards yourself. What we do is we call up our dearest person, whoever that might be to us. And if it's not a person, then our dearest pet or our dearest tree or flower or circumstance or what we love to do. Ideally, a person. We call them up and we say to them, may you be healthy. May you be at peace. May you feel my love. Letting that really leave your chest and go to them, however you see them. Next, we want to really bring to mind a benefactor, someone who's been so kind to us, made sure that we were on the right path, someone who cared about our present and future, bringing that person to mind, sending out to them, may you be full of thriving and well-being. May you receive kindness. May you feel my gratitude. Sending that out. And now calling to mind a neutral person. This could be, I don't know, the neighbor down the street that you might just say hello to. Maybe it's the person that works at the cash register that you see often at the store. Maybe the librarian at the library, if you still go to a library. Someone who doesn't cause reactivity inside, whether it be good, like full of pleasantness, or unpleasantness, just neutral. Pulling them to mind and sending them well-being. May you be safe. May you be loved. May you feel that I am grateful that you are neutral in my life. And finally, in our last round, we're actually going to turn it towards ourselves. Really feeling, what is it that you need in this moment? May you be safe. May I be safe. May I be healthy. May I be surrounded by community. May I be seen and loved. May those around me act with ometz lev, moral courage, savlanut, bearing the burden with me, and wise speech of truth, of emet, of right speech. Feel the love, feel that enter your hearts. Allowing yourself to sit in 1 minute of silent meditation, allowing all that to yeshuv da'at, to settle in as a great gift to yourself. I will ring the bell when it's time to come out of our meditation practice. And when you are ready, if you have your eyes closed, you can gently and slowly open them. If it is your practice to bow before Hashem, before God, the Almighty, please do so. Giving a great bow of gratitude to yourself for committing to this time together to practice and learn. A bow to our teachers and ancestors for passing this on to us. A bow to Torah, to mindfulness, the Dharma, TorahDharma, for passing this wisdom down to us so we can be on this path and Mussar mindfulness. Thank you to all of you for practicing and being here today. And I finally said that I'd share with you Our sponsorship, we had so many that I'm sorry that I'm losing my mind of who I picked out next, which I'll pull up here. Such beloved. So we want to show great gratitude to Paula Golowitz, and I want to make sure, yes. So Paula is a beloved member of one of our Mussar Vadim, our Mussar groups. She's a wonderful practitioner and adds so much vitality and life to our path and our practice. And she offered this sponsorship today in loving memory of my mother. So Paula, we thank you for supporting the Institute for Holiness, allowing this offering. Thank you so much for your sponsorship. For those of you who want to sponsor and honor someone or loving memory, just reach out. You have my email address at our website of Kehilat Mussar.